Last time on Australia at War. At 4:30 a.m. on the 25th of April 1915, the Anzacs landed at a difficult and desolate spot on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Battle of the Landing had temporarily exhausted both sides. Moreover, the landing had failed. The Australians and New Zealanders were unable to advance. Australian losses during the battle mounted to 2,277 men killed or wounded. Of the 600 Australians who took part in the attack, there were 372 casualties. Field Marshal Lord Kitchener recommended to the British War Cabinet that Gallipoli be evacuated. What had been planned as a bold stroke to quickly knock Turkey out of the war instead resulted in 26,111 Australian casualties.
On the Western Front, we were obviously, our first conflict and our major involvement in the war was taking place at Gallipoli. But in Europe, obviously, it was in full swing. The whole battle and the wars were taking place. The Battle of Ypres, they were struggling. The whole Western Front and the whole of Europe, with the British fighting there, had major struggles. Now, they were digging in, there is no doubt. They were digging in for trench warfare and getting ready to hold their place and really building out the reinforcement on the front line, almost ready for us as Australians to come in and add to that offensive.
Evacuation from Gallipoli in December 1915 did not mark the end of Australia's involvement in the war. After withdrawal, the two battle-worn Australian divisions returned to Egypt, and the Australian Imperial Force was reorganised and expanded from 2 to 5 infantry divisions. In March 1916, all 5 infantry divisions were progressively transferred to France along the Western Front, while the light horse regiments that had served as additional infantry during the Gallipoli campaign remained in the Middle East. When the Australian divisions arrived in France, the war on the Western Front had long been in a stalemate, with the opposing armies facing each other from trench systems that extended across Belgium and northeast France.
One of the facts probably was the trenches when they dug in. They did it strategically in a zigzag pattern when they built these trenches or dug in, so that you couldn't jump in. The enemy couldn't jump into your trench and then fire straight in a straight line and kill thousands of people. You could only have a couple of people in each of these designed zigzag pattern.
The Western Front was the main theatre of war during World War I. The 1st, 2nd, 4th and 5th Australian divisions were initially sent to the region of the Belgian border to gain familiarity with new weaponry of modern warfare. The development of machine guns and artillery favoured defensive over offensive operations. The Anzac Corps subsequently took up positions in a quiet sector south of Armentières on the 7th of April 1916. Although the Australians were in a relatively quiet sector, there were periods of sharp fighting, shelling and some heavy raids. By the end of June, over 600 men had been killed. During this time, Private William Jackson became the first man of the AIF to gain the Victoria Cross in France. He rescued wounded members of his raiding party from no man's land until his arm was blown off by a shell. While the Australians were in this position, they were spared from the disastrous first day of the Battle of the Somme, a series of battles fought along the Somme Valley in France. It was the main Anglo-French offensive of 1916 and was originally planned as part of a wider strategy of attacking Germany simultaneously on the western and eastern fronts, with the aim of destroying Germany's reserves of manpower. On July 1st, 1916, the British and French Army launched a great offensive.
It was a major offensive and it was major losses. It was really one of the horrifying stories amongst many in World War I. The casualty rates were just horrific. When we look into it, there were 60,000 casualties on the first day alone.
Over the next few weeks, the fighting and killing continued. Within weeks, 3 Australian divisions had been committed to the Somme, while the 5th Division remained in French Flanders, where they went into trench systems opposite the devastated village of Fromelles. It was at Fromelles where Australia took part in the first major battle on the Western Front. The 5th Division, positioned on the left flank, was the first in action during the Battle of Fromelles on the 19th of July 1916. They were accompanied by the 61st British Division, in a poorly planned and executed diversionary attack intended to draw German attention from the Allies' Somme operations. British General Sir Richard Haking devised a plan to attack Fromelles with the Australian Division under the command of the Australian Major General J.W. Mackay. The 5th Division and the 61st Division were new to the sector and lacked local battle experience. The men had to assault over open fields, crisscrossed with drainage ditches in the face of heavy machine gun and artillery fire. Many fell, while others were overwhelmed by German counterattacks. Barrage began at 11 a.m. The Australian 5th Division attacked at 6 p.m, supported by the British 61st Division. With both divisions making no positive gains, the British asked the already heavily strained Australian 15th Brigade to assist at 9 p.m. as dusk fell. A brave attempt was made by half of the Australian 58th Battalion, led by Major A.J.S. Hutchinson. However, the attack by the British 61st Division had been cancelled, but the news of this didn't reach the Australians in time. The attack by the Australians was doomed, and many more men, including Major Hutchinson, were killed. Ultimately, the attack failed, and no ground was taken.
It was really what you would call one big stuff-up. And to lose that many lives for something that didn't really gain much is what hurts really when I look into this and study it and walk on those fields and where they fought, is that it shouldn't have happened. And it certainly shouldn't have happened in the way that it did.
The battle at Fromelles was the only battle in which the AIF fought in the Western Front that failed to produce a positive response. The battle put the Australian 5th Division out of offensive actions for many months. Australia suffered 5,533 casualties in a single day. Brigadier General H.E. Pompey Elliott, a veteran officer who commanded the 15th Brigade, later said, "Practically all of my best officers, the Anzac men who helped to build up my brigade, are dead. I presume there was some plan at the back of the attack, but it is difficult to know what it was." Meanwhile, British attacks on the Somme had brought the front line close to the village of Pozières. It was here, in darkness, On July the 23rd, 1916, at 12:28 a.m, the 1st Australian Division made an assault supported by heavy artillery fire. The ruined village was taken in hard and intense fighting, and enemy counterattacks were repelled. The Germans responded by pounding the area with their artillery.
There was such bombardment by the enemy that you were literally, all around you were bombs going off left, right and centre, so that literally the ground you stood on was shaking second by second and minute by minute, and people were falling all around you, and not just falling, it wasn't just gunfire, there was heavy artillery, probably most artillery fire than in any other battle on the front line, and Pozières was horrific.
The capture of Pozières was a significant achievement, but within 5 days the 1st Division had lost 5,000 men. Sergeant Archie Barwick wrote, "All day the ground rocked and swayed from the concussion. We were all nearly in a state of silliness and half dazed, but still the Australians refused to give ground." The 1st Division were replaced by the 2nd, who lost 7,000 casualties in 12 days. The 2nd Division was replaced by the 4th, who pressed their attacks towards Mouquet Farm, exposing them to murderous shell fire and yet more counterattacks. For the men who were thrown into the fighting at Pozières, the experience was hell. The battlefield had become the focus of artillery fire from both sides. Fighting was wild and intense, while constant shelling would tear the ground from underneath them, folding in trenches and blowing away any hope of protection. Shrapnel tore men to pieces, while smoke covered the turned-up muddy ground.
The conditions that our guys and the Australian Infantry, AIF, had to put up with, again, was just horrendous looking at this one, and that was because of the major bombardment of that. There was really no ground left unturned. This is where it was just a mud quagmire. Not only were you in the battle, but you imagine having to walk through this mud, quicksand, with shells going off all over you. How they survived just the environment, let alone the battle, I will never know.
Even in the face of such slaughter, British General Gough still wanted to capture the area. And after the 3 divisions had mounted tragic and futile attacks at Pozières and suffered great losses, at 2/3 strength, each was sent into the inferno for a second tour.
General Gough's decision to keep pushing in areas that we were really being slaughtered, I find very challenging. We'd already lost and damaged 2/3 of our forces, and yet he sat there still from his office and said, "No, I want this area, you're going to get it, I don't care at what cost." And I guess it's words like that that really challenged me in seeing what they had to go in for and into with that. And we had just lost so many people in less than 1 or 2 kilometres. The death and casualty rate in that area was horrific, and he still wanted that. So the decision on that one I find very challenging. In fact, I can say I completely disagree with it, because it really didn't do anything other than, to be honest, I think powder and ego. It just should never have happened. It's a decision that should never have been made.
The last Australian attack on Pozières was on the 3rd of September 1916. The Australian 1st, 2nd and 4th Divisions had been used by their commanders as a battering ram and lost nearly 23,000 officers and men in a mere 6 weeks on a front that extended little more than a mile. the Somme put the first strain on Australia's voluntary recruitment system. The excitement and enthusiasm of the early weeks of the Gallipoli campaign had evaporated, and the period of strong voluntary enlistments was long past. This led to the first unsuccessful referendum to introduce conscription.
Back here in Australia, on the shores of Australia, that everybody, the whole conscription had changed. In the beginning, it was voluntary. Then through it was forced, in the sense that if you didn't go, there were labels put on you. By the end of the war, they were taking just about anybody, almost any age and almost in any condition. But the pressure from the public on technically an able-bodied young person was horrific, really. They almost kicked, scratched and punched anybody who they thought should be at the war, and they weren't. So it came pretty horrible on the streets of Sydney, Australia, any of the capital cities and country towns. The way that you were treated, it was almost like a criminal. And really that put a lot of pressure on the home front as well. It became almost, in a sense, barbaric. And that was the feel on the streets of Australia.
By year's end, the war was becoming a heavy burden for all Australians. Almost everyone knew some young man killed in the war, and the heavy losses were intruding into many households. Making things worse, victory appeared to be nowhere in sight. A schoolboy at the time, Brian Lewis later recalled, "There was no rush for the paper before breakfast to read of the new victory. There were victories in the paper, but we did not believe in them any longer."
On the shores of Australia, they're reading how come and fight and come and help our heroes because we're winning the war and we're taking ground. That was propaganda to get more people to come into the war. But how much truth was in these paper stories? Almost none. Propaganda, propaganda, propaganda in the whole lot, unfortunately. 1916 was a mass slaughter of some very good and our best people that we sent over that enlisted early. My great uncles enlisted in 1917 because of that first onslaught and saying, hey, we got victory and come over and help us win. But 1916 was a massive hit on Australia. We already had lost a lot of people. There were a lot of families that were distraught. There was a lot of information flooding back to individuals saying, you haven't got, we're missing in action, killed in action, wounded in action. I can't really paint the picture enough in this setting to say that it was horrific. And 1916, the beginning of that, where we poured all this resource in and lost so much of that. But 1916 was a traumatic time in Australia and on the front line and for the young people that went over there as well.
The Somme offensive did not achieve its goals, but it was one of a series of hammer blows that would eventually weaken the German army.